Hello YouTube family, my name's Deanna, this is the Haxton Knits channel, and I am really glad you're here with me today. I have had quite a few new subscribers this week, which I'm so excited about, so if you're new to the channel, hello! Well, welcome, I'm so glad you're here. That, of course, the new traffic into this channel was because I recently had my first pattern ever published in knitty.com. I made a whole not episode, but a whole video talking about my Hope Point pattern, which is hiding behind me here. So if that's something you want to know about, my new pattern release and all the details behind it, just click up here. We've got a link to a video or down below in the video descriptions. But I have lots of things for you today. So we're going to be talking about knitting in the Andes, or Andean knitting. Of course, the Andes being the lovely mountain range on the west coast of South America. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how not to knit a sock from the 1800s, because I have in fact finished that sock. And what else? I have new cast-ons, and of course I'm wearing my lovely finished object from last episode. This is Nightbook, and it is knit in Lemon Jelly Pool, which is this lovely green color. The colorway is called Soiree, and of course Lemon Jelly Pool is a yarn coming out of Japan, so coming out of Tokyo. And then the other colorway is Life in the Long Grass, and it's the sport weight yarn, and the colorway is called Prairie, which is a beautiful, beautiful hand-dyed yarn coming from Ireland. Gosh, I hope that's right. All right, let's get started, guys. So I've been trying to make it a little bit of a trend that I pick up some knitting and knit while I talk, and I thought this pattern was going to be a lovely, lovely project to work on, but I happened to put it down right in the middle of some short row lace. So I guess we could talk about my works in progress early in the episode. Normally I would start with, sort of my feature topic of the day and then move on to what I'm working on. But since it's out already, I know that right now, while it's all like crammed on the needles and scrunched up, this looks a little bit like some chewed up bubble gum, but it is in fact a gorgeous pattern and some amazing yarn. So this is, oh yeah, can you tell? I don't know how well you can tell. The shawl is called Waiting for Rain, and it is a gorgeous, stunning garter stitch shawl that works in these little wedges of lace, which I think is such a stunning contrast. Garter stitch is, of course, known to be a little bit chunky and a little stretchy and kind of rustic looking, at least I think so. And then to pair it with really sleek sections of lace, I think is such an interesting and stunning idea. And of course, lace is something that benefits from blocking. So this is going to be a project that is going to have some thoughtful blocking done. Yeah, let's talk about that right now. So something that I've been considering as I'm working on this is how I'm going to block it. And the reason I'm thinking about that is normally with something like a shawl, you would pin out just the outside edges and sort of stretch the shape. If there were some sort of border details, you might take time to pin out those border details. But in this case, we have knitting that's lace sort of wedged in different sections throughout the shawl. And in this case, if I wanted to really open up this lace and let it block and bloom and be just as beautiful as it possibly could be, it needs kind of a lot of stretch, as you can see I'm doing here. But to do that, I would have to stretch all of this garter stitch around it too. And garter stitch has a lot of elasticity, and really it doesn't benefit from heavy blocking. Garter stitch looks its most beautiful when it's allowed to stay kind of compressed, similar to ribbing. You wouldn't want to really stretch out ribbing when you're blocking it. So for this particular pattern, I plan to, when it's ready to block, actually block out the lace sections first. So I'll kind of lay it out in the general shape I think it's going to be, and then open up the lace and pin around each of those little sections, and then sort of gently block to shape the rest of it. So this is kind of a not entry-level blocking shawl, at least to get its full, beauty and striking elegance, I think. But let me tell you about this yarn because it's sort of special. Okay, gosh, I'm a nerd when it comes to yarn. This is Voolenvine. I'm always excited when I get to knit with my fellow YouTubers products, and she makes such stunning yarn. Voolenvine is of course Kristen. She's coming out of New York and she owns her own hand-dyed yarn company called Voolenvine. This particular skein here is a lovely sort of natural to off-white with gray and black and charcoal and even little teeny tiny bits of sort of a orange or coppery color speckles hidden through. This colorway is called Solstice, and this is her Volca base, which is a merino nylon cashmere. Of course we need cashmere shawls here in Okinawa, Japan, the tropical island, because cashmere is lovely, even if I'll never get to wear it. And the other skein here, so this is, the colorway is Fairy Hair, which is just a very light sort of ballerina pink to lavender. It's shiny. This is a single, so it's just lovely and shiny, which I don't know, there's nothing in here that should make it shiny. What we got, so this is her Nouveau base, which is 100% superwash merino. Yeah, it's just a lovely yarn, and I think that the contrast between these is so nice. There is something I want to say about this pattern if you're thinking about knitting it, is that the version I am doing is not the original version of the pattern. So as you can see, if I stretch this out, my pattern has some subtle stripes. The differences between the Solstice and the Fairy Hair is actually pretty low contrast, so it's a little bit tricky to see these stripes depending on what section I'm holding out. But subtle stripes and then these nice lace wedges. The stripes are not written in the original pattern, and neither is the border that I plan to put on this. But when you do purchase the pattern, it comes with the original pattern, which I'll show a picture of here. It's the sample picture on Ravelry is a solid gray, beautiful shawl. Yeah. No. Anyway, so it comes with the original pattern, but it also comes with like a how to hack this pattern instructions. And those instructions are a little bit vague. They're not like a step-by-step recipe. So they do say, like, when you want to add stripes, just start on, a right side or a wrong side road and do your stripes. They don't actually say, do 6 garter ridges, then do a stripe. You get what I'm saying? It's kind of a use your imagination, but here are some tips. It also comes, the hack this pattern also comes with a kind of fancier lace border, which I do plan on putting in on the bottom of this. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to put it in the Solstice colorway or the Fairy Hair colorway. I want to use the Fairy Hair. I think a little pink border would be really precious, but I'm not sure how much a single will do. I feel like borders need a little bit of structure and singles are kind of lighter. I hope that makes sense. So anyway, beautiful pattern that I plan to sit on and fiddle with and knit with while I talk to you this week, but alas, it's not to be because I can't follow a chart and do short rows and lace at the same time while talking to you. Sacrifices. All right, let's move on. So viewers of my channel know I've been sort of working on a series of historical knits or traditional knits. We're exploring knitting of different regions of the world, and this all started with my Orenburg lace shawl, which I will show you my progress on a little bit later. And of course, I'll link you up to my video on the Orenburg lace if you're interested in that. But this week I thought I would talk a little bit about Andean knitting or Peruvian knitting. And just like with my Koichan knitting video, I actually knit something in this tradition years ago before I really realized what was going on. And that is a pattern from this guy here. So this is 2006 Vogue Knitting presents Knitting.1. I have no idea how far this magazine went, if it stayed in print or didn't stay in print, but it was one of the earlier knitting magazines I remember purchasing. And In this is, actually, it's funny flipping through this because there are several patterns in here that I knit over the years, and it's funny to kind of look back and remember working on these. But this is the hat that sort of represented Lima, Peru. The series in this magazine is there's patterns from kind of different regions of the world, and it's talking about knitting worldwide. And this particular hat was something that I knit. Oh gosh, I'm going to put a picture of me in here. This is Haxton Knits from a while back when I still had my cute little nose ring and I was still just a little wee baby who had just started doing colorwork knitting for the first time. So what I know now, this particular pattern, if you're going to knit it, is number 10, but I will link to the pattern itself down below on my Ravelry page. This pattern is styled after the Chulo hat. Am I saying that right? C-H-U-L-L-O. Cholo? Chulo? Chilo? So this pattern is knit after that traditional hat from the Andean region, which is the Chilo hat. So what I didn't know at the time that I was knitting this pattern is that it's pretty loosely based off of the traditional Chulo hat that is knit in the Andean region. In particular, the fit of the hat. So the traditional hats of this region are knit by men, typically worn by men, and much closer fitting to the head. I think by like a US standard or kind of a modern standard of hat wearing, most people would think it was too small, but it is a close to the head fitting hat, almost a skull cap with ear flaps. And I have seen several pictures of traditional wear of this item where they wore that hat with another hat over top that had a wide brim to protect the face from the sun. So there were some things that were right and some things that were wrong about this hat. One of the things that actually was kind of interesting is apparently typically these hats, if they have a long tail like this one does, in some regions they'll flip the knitting upside down so that the motifs are the same as with your head. So imagine you're knitting a long tube but it flips over. You know, one side will be upside down. So actually in a lot of sort of the regions of the Andes where these hats are knit, they would actually flip the motifs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's stop looking at this book. Hold on. Stop looking at this book. I just want to point out, I have knit so many of these patterns in here and they're gone. Where do they go? Where do the patterns go? So first of all, these thigh-high socks, I definitely knit in a black and pink Zuber ball. I don't know where those went. Those are gone. They never stayed up, so I obviously should revisit them and knit them again. Oh, of course I knit that lovely hat. I do remember knitting this fun fur face mask, except I did not put fun fur on it. I just made a face mask and then it was green and I sewed little eyeballs onto it so it looked like a frog mask. I remember desperately wanting to knit this like crop top and gauntlet, which thankfully I never did because my fashion sense is questionable enough. Let's talk first about what is Andean knitting. So let's talk about the region. The Andes are, of course, the mountain range on the west coast of South America, and that covers countries like Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. And when you talk about the Andean people, you're talking about the people who were descendants of the Incan Empire. So Incan Empire is something they were really well known for was their use of alpaca and their alpaca textiles. It was interesting, I was watching a couple of like documentaries, linked below. I feel like I'm doing a lot of linking today, but I made a playlist as I was kind of researching topics for today's video, and something they mentioned was that in the archaeological sites and tombs and things like that, when they find samples of alpaca textiles from the Incan era, the micron count, the quality of the fiber is actually much nicer than what we can currently produce today. Even with like all of our like scientific breeding and like controlled breeding and things like that, there just isn't the same quality of alpaca fiber being produced today as there was at the height of the Incan Empire. And I have some theories about that. So I've been watching a couple of documentaries, and of course the end of the Incan era was when the Spanish came in. So the Spanish came in and pretty much wiped out that entire civilization. Yay, European conquest. And there were some mentions of Incans burning things that were valuable so they wouldn't fall into Spanish hands, and talk of Spanish slaughtering like 90% of the alpaca population, because that was like this valued commodity and, you know, helped destabilize the empire and things like that. So I kind of feel like we lost the really good quality animals during this time period, and as we've bred back, we just haven't been able to reach back to that same quality of animal, which is really interesting, and not something that I am fully an expert on. So I'd love to hear more about that if any of you guys know more about that topic. Incan Empire, alpacas were definitely in use, weaving was definitely in use. Knitting came to this region again with European influence. And like so many regions where knitting came into the region and was adopted by local tradition and local craft, it really blossomed into a distinct style of textile. And one of the things that you should notice right away when you look at samples of Andean knitting are their use of color and motif. This is again an area where stranded color work is done, so just like Fair Isle, just like the Koichan knitting that I talked about before, stranded color work was a technique that was used, but it was used uniquely to those, unique as in differently from those other regions. When I think of Fair Isle knitting, I think of kind of predictable repeats, sort of short patterns. They tend to be geometric, they tend to be symmetric, so they mirror each other on different sides. This is not true of Andean knitting. You see complicated motifs, images of animals or plants or people. Sometimes they don't repeat, sometimes they do, sometimes they're facing different directions from each other. The charts are really, and I say charts because I'm thinking of myself knitting a pattern that was styled after that, but I don't actually know that there was charted patterns. I didn't actually look into that, so someone tell me. The patterns are very complicated, and to me it's really interesting because not only do they not knit in these very short predictable repeats, but they also knit in a style that is very different than other regions of the world. So what I want you to do is I want you to picture yourself knitting on double pointed needles. You have like 4, you know, and what you're doing is you are knitting on the needles closest to your body. So you're looking at the right side of your tube of knitting and you're working that way. Well, in Andean knitting, not all regions, but there are some regions, what you would actually need to do is turn your needles around so that you are actually working on the needles farthest away from you. And of course this means you're looking at the wrong side of the tube and knitting, instead of knit stitches, mainly purl stitches because you're working on the inside. And so not only are they doing these very complicated, non-repeating patterns, but they're also doing them while looking at the inside of their work, which I think is really interesting. And you can see how this happens. So something that you will see in this region is knitters will throw their working yarn around their neck to cause tension, using their thumb to create the purl stitch, which I thought was a really fascinating. To me it doesn't feel natural, like it doesn't feel like you would just naturally find your way to knitting that way, but of course that's because I don't knit that way. And it's just a very fascinating way to see that knitting adapted. It makes you wonder, you know, did knitting in the region actually travel in from other knitting zones, or did it sort of develop organically on its own, in which case you'd see these different styles of knitting. And I know that, I'm pretty sure Richard Rutt, I'm pointing down at this book, pretty sure he addresses a little bit of this in this book, The History of Knitting, but I also would like to recommend this book here. This is Andean Folk Knits. The author of this book lived in Bolivia. I don't know if she was doing outreach or missionary or something with the Mennonite community, but lived there and wrote this beautiful book. The pictures are stunning, and there's a significant amount of history and technique as well as original patterns, mostly for little kind of purses and bags. beautiful book, beautifully written. I actually bought this book when I was doing the Master Knitter program because it's you have to write a paper about different knitting techniques, and I did fair isle knitting and Andean colorwork or Andean knitting. Another kind of fun fact, interesting thing about knitting in the Andes region is you will see knitters who will do intarsia in the round, which most of you, if you do intarsia, know that it's kind of not done because you need the yarn. Basically, if you're knitting flat, you carry your yarn across the row and drop it, continue across the row and come back, and then pick it up. So if you are knitting in the round, if you go all the way around, when you reach your color block again, your yarn's over here and you can't use it. But in the Andes region, what some knitters will do is they will knit in the round, they will take their working yarn, which is way over here, and sort of estimate how much yarn they're going to need. Maybe they know they need 10 stitches, so they'll wrap it around a needle 10 times. And then they will take that and they will knit, they'll stretch it and knit what they need. And if they have too much or too little at the end, they'll come back and fudge the yarn, you know, kind of pull the working yarn left or right to make it a nice even tension. And I thought that was really interesting. It's not something I would have thought to have done, but it's a neat little tip or trick that you can put in your tool house if you ever needed to use it. So that was exciting. It was an interesting sort of bit of Andean knitting. As always, when I start researching to talk about some of these topics, anything I find on YouTube, I create a playlist. So if you're interested, there's a beautiful documentary that I have linked below, and I'll probably put a little doobly-doo up here, talking all about knitting. It follows a family of alpaca farmers that live up in the highlands, and then it kind of follows their fiber through all the way into like the big industry of spinning the fiber into yarn and eventually knitting it into products and selling it. Let's talk about how not to knit a pair of socks from the 1800s. First of all, just a little side quest. If you are on Reddit right now, the knitting community, actually I'm sure it's other communities too, but there's this fun little trend happening right now of holding up our knitting as if we had caught ourselves a great fish, especially our socks. So I could not help but hold up this great fish of a sock with my great carp wind socks, since it is Golden Week here in Okinawa, Japan. Okay, so viewers of my channel know that I have been deep diving into the Victorian knitting manuals. Thank you, Richard Rutt, and his History of Knitting and his donation of his knitting archive to archive.org. So I have been working on a book published in the late 1800s called Wools and How to Use Them. And this is Gentleman's Sock number 5. This is of course knit in Malabrigo sock yarn. I don't remember the colorway, and it didn't turn out as huge as I thought it was going to be. So as I mentioned in my last episode, one of the challenges of knitting from 1800s books is trying to figure out what type of yarn and needles to use. And I did figure out that this particular book was using the steel wire gauge, and so I could estimate that I needed to be knitting on a 00 to 000 needle. But the wool was kind of a guess based on the number of stitches I had to cast on, and if I were to do it again, I might go down to an even thinner wool. But if you've used Malabrigo sock yarn, you know that it is a pretty lightweight fingering weight yarn. It's on the lighter end of the fingering weight spectrum. But these do in fact fit my husband, and there were some fun little tidbits I learned along the way. So as I got started knitting, it's our knit from the top down. There was no special cast on, just your typical long tail cast on. I was a bad girl. I did not follow the rules of knitting, as I will scroll across the page here. One of the first rules they mention is that you should hold the tail and knit it into the first 6 stitches to essentially weave it in. And I did not do that, and I have a very good reason why. It's because I disagree with this pattern. This particular rule I think works fine if you are knitting in stockinette stitch or maybe garter stitch. But when it comes to ribbing, I don't think you should weave in your ends going straight across the ribbing. It just creates too much bulk and interferes with some of the stretchiness. So I actually, when I weave in yarn tails with knitting, I will take my needle. I might do 1 or 2 duplicate stitches, but eventually I will start grabbing one leg of the knit column as it appears from the inside. It'll be, you know, the purl column from the outside. One leg, and I'll work my way this way, feeding my needle through, and I'll of course take a picture of this so you can see it a little better. But that way I don't lose the elasticity and don't get a lot of bulk. So that's, you know, one way I ignored this pattern. I was tempted to really follow the pattern all the way through, but that one little thing I just couldn't do it. Fun facts, fun little Easter eggs or golden bits I found along the way. When I talked about this last week, of course I was just on the ribbing, so it was difficult to see, but this pattern incorporates the use of a seam stitch. And let me just right away ask you to forgive my knitting tension on this. I'm actually in the process of changing the way I knit. So I am a self-taught knitter, and over the years I've realized the way I knit is a little bit inefficient, and I've been trying to change over. This is actually the second time I've changed the style of knitting. I was originally a thrower, and now I'm a picker, and now I'm trying to be a more efficient picker. And actually it's funny, as I've been working on this, I did some time trials, and I'm knitting about 300 stitches an hour faster now that I've switched knitting styles. But this sock, I was kind of going back and forth between the two, and I definitely have a different tension, which you can see. Another thing you can see on here is the decreases are all knit together. So I'm going to show you a couple of close-up pictures, but there are some leg decreases here and some heel decreases where you can really see that I have a different sort of edge on one side versus the other. And it's not because the slip knit wasn't around. I've definitely seen mirrored decreases in books of this era and earlier. I see typically the slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over more often than I would see like a slip knit. Oh gosh, I got way ahead of myself. Okay, let's get back to the seam. So the use of this seam, this is essentially one garter stitch seam. And in the pattern in this book, they use it as your stitch marker. So basically instructions will be knit to the seam and then 3 stitches past and do your short rows, etc., etc. And eventually the seam actually follows all the way around the curve of the heel, and then you stop and you add 2 new seams on the edges, and these become your guideposts for your decreases later on. There was one really fun, kind of cutesy little thing in here. Can you see these? I was knitting the pattern, and it suddenly came on a section where it was giving me yarn overs and knit 2 togethers, and I thought, what is this? It is actually a size marker. So you make yourself 5 yarn overs and then of course decrease with the corresponding knit 2 togethers. And that indicates that this is a size 5 sock. And I'm presuming that is because you might be making these to sell. So you might be craning out quite a bit of them and need to keep track of which ones are which sizes. Or maybe it's because you have a household of people who wear different size socks, and it just helps you keep track of whose socks are whose. I don't know, but it's interesting. It was just a fun little thing to pick up as I worked on these. But overall, I was really surprised to see that these are essentially, I mean, there's not a lot of surprises in here. It's a nice 2x2 ribbed cuff. It's got a heel flap with a little short row turned heel and gusset. It's got, you know, just your typical decreases for your toes. It is essentially the same sock we're knitting now. You know, I don't have the fish lips kiss heel, or, you know, the fancy this or the fancy that, or crazy socks, but it is still essentially the same sock that I was knitting before I went down this deep dive. There was one little decrease that was a little different that I don't think I see anymore. I don't know if you can see it here, but it is after you turn your heel. So typically what we will do is we'll create our heel flap, right? And we'll do our little turn. And then we will pick up stitches for these gussets and decrease back down to our original stitch count. Well, this pattern has decreases here, but it also has decreases up here. And as a result, let's see if you can see it, it creates kind of a nice little cupped heel so that like where your instep is, it kind of pulls in a little bit. And I thought that was a very interesting piece of shaping that I just don't see very often anymore in modern patterns. And I think will find its way into many more of my future socks. If you're interested in knitting these socks, definitely pop over to archive.org. It's a completely free website. It can be a little bit tricky to find patterns and things in there. If you search for wools and how to use them, or wool and how to use them, you will be able to find this book, and then in the subtext of the book you'll be able to find collections it's listed in, and that's also where the Richard Rutt historical Victorian knitting collection is. On a side note, there will be only one Victorian sock because I ran out of yarn and really had no intention of knitting two. I offered to knit my husband another pair, and he said he would be totally fine if they were a different color, but the only other color I have is this like kind of obnoxious hot pink. So yeah, that's it. No more knitting of this particular sock, but maybe I'll knit myself a smaller pair for me. I have a couple of works in progress to share with you this week. Of course I have to show you my Orenburg lace shawl. I have one edge done. Of course this is not blocked. The tricky thing about Orenburg lace is that it is all garter stitch and all of the decreases are the same. They're all knit two togethers. So as a result, there isn't really a right side or wrong side, so I'm not really sure which side I'm showing you. But I did unfortunately put this little piece of knitting on the scale and realized that I did not have nearly enough yarn, so I did order some more yarn. In fact, I ordered a kilogram cone of more yarn. So we're gonna have Alpaca Yarn Apocalypse coming up here shortly. So this, unfortunately, I'm just gonna put it in timeout until my mail arrives, and then we can pick it up again. I'm a little bit horrified at how big this is turning out. So this is of course one edge of a square shawl, so there will be 4 more of these, and then the center will be filled in. So it's gonna be big. Ugh, it's gonna be big. That's okay, because you fold it in half to make it a big triangle, and then you drape it across yourself and you bask in its warmth. It's occurring to me that I have a shawl knitting addiction, and I don't wear shawls, and I don't live in a cold climate. So some of these may actually go up for sale. I've been considering just kind of setting up a craft shop or pop-up shop at the local craft fair and selling some of these just to get them out of the stash. Good news is if for some reason I lose my knitting mojo, I do have a beautiful scarf already done and ready to go. So this is of course the Orenburg warm shawl. I talk extensively about that in a couple episodes back. And the lace is Alpaca by Gist Yarn, which is a yarn that weaving company. It's interesting, they don't give you any specs on this yarn. Like, it just says alpaca. Is it 100% alpaca? I hope so, but they don't really say. So here's my lovely cone. This is the smaller one, and the larger one is on its way. Mail is so slow here. I actually have quite a few acquisitions in the works. So I have the Gist yarn on its way. I have several balls of Sweet Georgia yarn on its way. I dipped into my advent calendar and you know, fell in love and had to order more. So there will be some of that coming. Ooh, what else? I ordered something else. I ordered a blanket quantity of yarn because one of my coworkers asked me to knit a blanket, and for some awful reason I said yes, and so there will be a blanket in the future. I have a new cast on this week, but I do not want you guys to get attached to this because I don't think it's going to be around for much longer. I cast on this, this is Friesland by Jenny Soap. This is a gorgeous Colorwork blanket. I originally bought it to be the blanket for my baby blanket. I talked about this before, but I worked as a labor and delivery nurse, and I had a blanket where I was knitting a motif for every baby I delivered. So I put that all together. But originally I had picked this pattern to use for that blanket, and I quickly realized that I would have to be knitting on like lace weight, cobweb weight yarn because I was delivering so many babies that it wasn't going to be practical. It would have been a mountain of a blanket. And at the time I remember thinking, knitting on that fine yarn, that it was a little bit fiddly and I just kind of wasn't getting in the groove of it. So what did I do? I decided to make it more fiddly by doing it not as stranded color work, but as double knitting. So as you can see, maybe you can see here, I had started one of these squares and it is worked in double knitting. I don't think that there's much hope that I'm going to continue working on this. And it's a shame because it is such a beautiful, beautiful pattern. And I, of course, you guys already know I don't really love double knitting, so I don't know what inspired me here. I think it was because I had these two gorgeous balls of yarn just kind of sitting within arm's reach and I wanted to knit with them. This is, again, more of this yarn, the leftover yarn, the Life in the Long Grass Sport, and this is like Roxanne Knits. It's a beautiful yarn that came in one of my knit crates a long time ago. So don't get attached. I'm not really sure why I even showed it to you because I'm really gonna pull it out in just a moment. But I do have another work in progress, which you guys may remember. Oh my gosh, so this is a long forgotten friend here. Unfortunately, my shoulder surgery is the reason why this one went into the languishing pile for a really long time. No, it is not a scarf or wrap or shawl or blanket. It is a piece of knitted artwork that I'm eventually going to stretch on a very large frame, the frame that is usually behind me when you see me in this room, but not today. So the inspiration to knit this, I was thinking about when I finished my Master Knitter program. I had done some research on the history of knitting and reading about what knitting guilds look like and the process that people had to go through to become named like a master knitter or to have finished their apprenticeship with a knitting guild. And one of the things they make is a tapestry or a rug or a wall hanging. And you can find pictures of them in that Richard Rutt book and on the internet in general if you search around. Most of them are pretty spectacular. When I look at them, I have a hard time thinking they were all hand knit. I wonder if they were like peg or frame knit. If they were hand knit, they include maybe stranded color work and embroidery and intarsia, and they're just kind of crazy and make me realize that I, even though I feel like I'm a pretty advanced knitter, have a long way to continue to grow and learn when it comes to knitting. But that was the inspiration to knit myself some of my own artwork or wall hangings. So I had a big open picture frame that I didn't really love and decided I was going to knit an image to go onto it. Full disclosure here, so this image that I am knitting is not mine. I do not own it. I wasn't really sure if this process was going to work when I started it, so I just kind of was Googling images that I thought would translate well into knitting. So this is of course a David Mitchell design. I'll put a link to his website, and it's a sketch that he did called Winter Trees. And I thought that would work well because I figured I could do it originally in 2 colors. I thought I would do it in black and white, but I ended up putting it into actually 3 colors. And you can see a little bit of this image here. So I am doing 3 colored stranded color work, and I'll talk extensively about this bad boy when the day comes that I actually finish him, which is quickly approaching. I actually have only about 30 rows left. You can see he's pretty big. As I've been working on this, I have been just kind of discovering new techniques, and there are things I would change if I were to do it again. And it's been most tempting to turn this first into a skirt, and then into a dress, and then into a just giant, cuddly cowl scarf. But alas, this is destined to be steeked, cut open, stretched, tortured, and hung eventually on my wall as a beautiful piece of knitted artwork. And it's funny because as I've been working on this, at several points I was like, I'm never doing this again. This is taking forever. Oh my gosh. And now that I am approaching the end of it, I'm already starting to eyeball another picture frame that I want to try to do another image with. So we'll see. There may be another one of these. There is a particular photograph of Shuri Castle the night that it caught fire and burned down that I think is very striking. It's a black picture with flames, so I'm thinking like 5 or 6 colors of red or orange or yellow and black and white. So maybe this will be a second project, but we will give you the full gory details of all the mistakes I made along the way and the things I wished I'd done and the things I've learned while working on my very own final, master knitter project, maybe in another episode or two. And for finished objects this week, of course, last week I shared this beautiful piece of sweater. This week's is much, much smaller. I have many little fishes, and they are the little teeny tiny socks that I have been working on. I did originally intend to knit a lot more of these, but as I was finishing them, I was hanging them up and eventually reached a point where I was happy with what I had on the wall. So these little guys are done. All of this excess yarn, these are all still little scraps and bits that I had left over from other projects. I'm thinking about knitting some hats and donating them to the NICU. So making little brightly colored baby hats or baby socks. Maybe, we'll see how that goes. If you guys are knitters who are thinking about donating to a hospital, we see a lot of donations come into the hospital for units like the NICU or the nursery, make sure that they are going to survive heavy machine washing. So these are going to be yarns that are going to be like boiled, bleached, maybe not necessarily bleached, but put through the ringers, and there needs to be no long floats that are going to get caught in things, nothing that's going to felt at all, nothing that's going to get super fuzzy as you work with it. So just think about that if you are knitting projects for donations for hospitals. But these are all sock yarns that I think will survive some pretty heavy duty washing. So yeah, that's it actually. I have no more knitting to talk about, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about life in Okinawa this week. I mentioned last week that the holiday week is upon us. It is, of course, Golden Week that we are rolling into right now, but it is also the start of typhoon season. Yay! Okay, so typhoon is the exact same thing as a hurricane, guys. We're just different part of the world, different language. And Okinawa is right in the path of the typhoon zone, which is why all of the houses out here are made out of cement and are sturdy, and why there are bars over a lot of the windows, because flying debris flies through windows if they're not protected. We did have our first storm just kind of tucked south of us, but we did get hit with just all the outer bands of rain, so it's made for quite a wet and dreary weekend. Fun little fact I discovered, so when I moved into my house, they had like pruned back all of the trees in the yard to almost nothing. Like there was literally like a stump with one little twig with like 2 leaves on it. So the first couple of, honestly the first year we were here, we didn't really know what the trees were. They were just kind of recovering and growing back. But during the rain and the wind and the storm, I noticed that I was hearing like, I thought it was pebbles or hail. I'm from Florida, so I've heard hail before, in Texas and things like that. But there's no hail here, so I couldn't figure out what I was hearing. And I went outside and I was finding that coming off of my trees were these little fruits. And it turns out that the tree in my yard is a mango tree. And I am going to have mango apocalypse if all of these little fruits survive, because there have to be hundreds of mangoes growing on my tree right now. So I'm very excited. I've been like doing the Googling, doing the searching, like polling the Reddit, how to take care of mango trees. So hopefully I will have some delicious mangoes in the coming months. I don't know anything about growing mangoes. It is also road tax season here. This is a much more boring topic, but if you're interested in life here in Japan and Okinawa, in the United States, if you want to drive, you get your driver's license, you buy insurance, and you drive. Some states have emissions testing, don't they? I think some states. Yeah, I'm not actually sure about that. I remember as a kid having emission testing, and then it went away, and I haven't lived in a state that had that in a long time. But here, there's a little bit more. So you have to get your license, in my case, like an international license or a special license. Get your insurance, and then you also have to do what's called a Japanese compulsory insurance, which is every 3 years you have to go take your car in and you have to get it inspected, and whatever they find wrong you have to fix it and then come back, get it re-inspected, and that's mandatory. And then also every year is road tax. So if you drive a vehicle, you pay a road tax. And so that is the season right now. It's actually kind of interesting, all the cars, it depends on what size engine you have. So I have a teeny tiny key car, which means I have a teeny tiny engine. It's mostly powered by hamsters, and I have to go over to my local city office. You like go upstairs, you fill out all the paperwork, and then they give you a paper, and then you go downstairs to the bank, and then you pay, and then they give you a receipt, and you go back upstairs, and then you get your paper, and then you drive to this other place and you get a sticker. It's a lot, but it is the season. It's like a holiday. It has to be paid by the end of May. So that is life in Okinawa. Isn't that exciting? Road tax and storms and Golden Week, which hopefully is going to be a safe week with no major parties and no upflares in the coronavirus. Alright guys, that is everything I have for you today. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I hope you're staying safe. Those of you in the southern parts of the United States, I know you're starting to hit your tornado and hurricane season. Hurricane season is what I'm going for. So I hope you're staying safe away from all the hurricanes. I know the heat is definitely starting to turn on. Things are starting to get warm. You know, at least if you live in the south, those of you in the north, whatever, you and your cold weather can just be cold for a few more months. Alright guys, as always, if you would like to know more about me, you can find me on Instagram and Ravelry as Haxton Knits. I am so excited about my pattern that went live on Knitty. Oh my gosh, I almost forgot to tell you. Guys, okay, so yes, my pattern is up right now. The spring and summer thing on Knitty has my Hoke Point pattern. But go back one season to the winter Knitty. You guys gotta check out this pattern. So it looks like just a standard sweater. It's like a long sleeve sweater with patterning. But you have to check out the way it is made. It is knit in one giant piece. It kind of looks like a giant hat, but it's got steeks running up each side, and you cut those open and sew them together to make your sleeves and your body. And that way your sleeves and body perfectly match up. It's the coolest pattern I've ever seen. You have to go over and check out that. That is on the winter issue of Knitty that's live right now. And then go check out my pattern, and then knit my pattern, and then share it on Instagram. Because yeah. Alright guys, have a great day. I'll see you next week.